Can you hear me?
Great. Okay.
All right, and I'll share my screen.
So I'll ask you to stick to the 10 minutes if possible. Thank you
I'll
again.
I'll make some effort to stick to 10 minutes, and it helps also that my talk is following the very interesting talks of Professor Wu, who set an agenda to discuss things at the firm level and in relation to the theories of innovation, which is, I think, how I want to place my talk, and also to address a question which was at the end of Professor Lemma's talk, can Chinese experiences be emulated elsewhere? So the point here is, first of all, to contextualize Chinese technology companies within innovation theory a bit. I won't go on at length about that in my 8 minutes. But I'll focus on the sources of novel practices, and the purpose is to understand how ideas transfer back and forth. Excuse me. And so the link between what I'm going to be speaking about and the overall theme of this meeting has to do with how ideas will travel between China and the UK and elsewhere. So I'll speak a little bit at the first about in Japan and how it was that our view of the growth of Japanese innovation was different. And then I'll talk about how China is also different. So the continuity and the distinctions in the way in which Chinese innovation practices emerge. And then I'll focus on 3 examples of that, and then end with a bit of a discussion on differences in extent and differences in kind. Well, so let me say it out at the outset that in the course of the 20th century history of technology in industry, Japan was different, and Japan was different in particular because it was able to adapt and extend primarily American-sourced innovation practices and to routinize them. So just in time, the advanced supply chain informatics, consultation and feedback practices in groups. These kinds of practices emerged mainly in the United States, mainly during the 1950s and 60s and into the 70s, and were adapted and applied systematically with great success in Japan during this period, fostered by national policies that were directed at ensuring that firm level activities were maximized. This was supported by the Japanese financial services community and their patient capital practices, along with export guarantees and the opportunities for long-term planning. Japan, you may recall, was also vilified in the United States during the 1970s and into the 80s for underhanded practices, for abusing opportunities to exploit American leadership. And we see a little echo of that now. So I'm not going to make a strong comparison between what happened in Japan and what's happening in China now, but I do want to emphasize that insofar as Japan did things which were somewhat different, China is also at the firm level doing things that are somewhat different. But let's look, as we did with Japan, at the sources of these ideas, and then we can come to a better understanding of the extent to which such ideas can be properly reformed, re-exported, and built into collaborations. So as we see with the case of Japan, recent American experiences were very important in China, and as where Japan experimented at the level, for example, of Nissan shop floor teams and at Toyota and elsewhere, China also experimented, but here at the level of the sector nationally. And so we're taking advantage, we're seeing the Japanese industry taking advantage of scale and also the very rapid rise of competition in high-tech areas domestically, to see variation in the way in which technologies are being experimented with in the Japanese case, and uh, it shows us something about the way that uh, uh, the scale differences make a difference. This coincided, of course, with the boom in especially the availability of engineers, a growth that we can trace back about 15 years or so, and the opportunity to take advantage of uh, a wide variety of new resources entering into the labor market, along with certain liberalization practices of labor markets that began to occur in uh, in 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 uh, in controlled manner over the past 20 years. This is fostered by some direct technology transfer from European and American multinational corporations. Of course, this history starts back in the 1950s and even much earlier in some cases, with German engineering firms in particular having solid foothold, but also uh, aggressive copying and strategic acquisitions, which I think this audience will be quite familiar with. Well, let me look at three what I call distinct innovation practices. The first one I want to emphasize is that developed by Xiaomi. This and much of the research that I'm reporting on is in the pipeline and going to be published along with my main collaborator, Bao Huang, who just finished a PhD at the London School of Economics. So I'll just talk a little bit about this as an example, an important one, of innovation practices that emerged in the past 10 years and which have roots in, in mainly Silicon Valley type of practices, but have been adapted, expanded, modified, and in particular routinized by Xiaomi and then emulated by other Chinese companies in particular. And we can see in the graph at the bottom the extent to which this online interactive innovation practice contributed to the relative success of the uh, 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 different competing companies in the case of the smartphone industry. This is not the only industry that this gets applied to. But we see now that after having taken ideas from Amazon, Apple, and others, scaled and refined them, and then fed them back, we see Apple and Amazon responding. We see also companies like Tesla extending their opportunities to harness very large scale online interaction with customers and participative fans. And they do so, Xiaomi, like Tesla, primarily using social media. So they're disseminating their products in the same medium as eliciting innovative inputs. And even top executives participate in Xiaomi, as is the case in Tesla. The second example to point to is innovation practices in corporate governance. And here, the basic problem, of course, has to do with how we can rapidly grow and focus the attention of firms while overcoming principal agency problems and also the kind of problems that appear with principal principals, where ownership leads to either conflict or at least divergent directions of development. And here we see examples in Chinese companies in particular, taking, again, Silicon Valley models initially of stock ownership plans. There's earlier history of this from companies like John Lewis and the Cadbury Company in Britain, but we see the refinement of these ideas in high-tech sectors early on in Silicon Valley, but then extended, uh, uh, disseminated rapidly in the Chinese companies, and feeding in directly to the opportunities that well-run employee stock ownership plans can contribute to patent outputs and other innovation practices. Well, in the meantime, of course, the game is also changing, and competition is fueling all kinds of interrelationships with uh, uh, patent use. This chart is just a dramatic illustration of patent lawsuits. Uh, it, it, I think it's actually quite interesting and sometimes amusing to see how these interactions occur, and to think about the way in which the game is played and the relative opportunities to input into innovation innovation goods occur. The third innovation practice has to do with platforms. We have lots of examples of platform innovation in Chinese companies. I'll speak a little bit about two of them. One of them, because they're a bit counterintuitive in some ways. One is Transfar, a platform for trucking industry, where among something like 30 million truck drivers in China, Transfar deals with about 2.6 or 2.8 million truck drivers on a kind of Uber style relationship. That is, it's low capital intensive in that Transfar doesn't own trucks, low in the requirements of employment relations, in that it doesn't employ, it has self-employed or subcontracting trucking companies working with them, but they provide the infrastructure through something called road harbors, where hospitality, fuel, warehousing, and indeed market making practices occur. And a very interesting scaling up, in particular, modification and transfer of what we might think of as something like an Uber model. The other interesting example of a platform business outside of our normal scope of consideration is a company called Wen's, where it's in the agricultural business and it owns no farms. So again, like Uber, it has tied farmers who own their own land, and what Wen's provides is animal stock, feed, consumables, and also, very importantly, standardization practices, expertise, coordination, monitoring of the whole practice, including the life cycle of chickens and pigs through surveillance technologies and big data analysis. And then it arranges the transport to abattoirs that it also does not own, so no capital investment there, and is able by this mechanism to scale up tremendously, an innovation that's quite distinct. So let's try to think in the way that we look back on Japanese innovations in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. What is it about Chinese innovation? Where does it come from, and where is it going? So first of all, let's distinguish between differences in extent and differences in kind. Of course, scale is always the big story looming in the background. There's also differences in speed. Now, part of that speed comes just from the fact of the rapid growth of the Chinese economy, the disproportionate rapid growth of the tech sector, but also the ability then to respond to these opportunities for growth through rapid iteration, a tolerance for rapid failure, a kind of California type tolerance we see with the life cycle of startups dying quickly and moving on. But there are also differences in kind. And so these perhaps are more interesting and address the question about what we want to imagine as distinctive that would be worthy of emulation, and that we might be capable of emulating so long as we have a clear enough understanding of how it fits into the practices and capabilities of British and other firms. So I enumerate them here, one to do with exploiting online access, another to do with applications of course, machine learning and digitalization, but also these major shifts in governance. And we see this with the employee state share ownership plans and variations, modifications, extensions of those. And these practices, which I haven't spoken about now, but our work will be presenting rigorous quantitative analysis of ways in which the routinization of knowledge sharing and the exploitation of engineering capacity, how to take advantage of the engineer premium that's offered by the Chinese labor market, how that occurs. So
Great.
I'll come to an end. Yes.
Great. Thank you.
So of course, we've heard about these major waves of things. Let's associate them with particular kinds of management practices and the characteristics of certain kinds of companies. I'll just end with a few points about how China has to some extent by luck of timing, using the engineering dividend and also the opportunities that are afforded by national policies and indeed state financing opportunities to accelerate these coordinated activities, and that in this way we can understand, I think, better some of the things that Professor Wu was addressing about where competition with the United States and Europe is likely to occur. And we can begin to look at some of those areas where there are weaknesses to see which kinds of innovative practices are likely to emerge, how they're going to be disseminated, what affect the engineer dividend, what affect the scale factors, what affect the tolerance for variation and experimentation in the Chinese domestic market can do for those areas. So I'll leave it at that and hope that
Thank
we can
you.
have